Good afternoon. We are going to get started. It's 4:02. I know people are still sort of joining in. My name is Arun Pastrija. I'm currently a TIE of Houston board member, so welcome you to this webinar. I've been involved with TIE for the last 20 years. I just served in the TIE board for many, many years, and I was also president of TIE Houston in 2017 and 2018. In my day job, I manage a company called CHR Solutions. We do IT managed services and telecom billing software. I have the pleasure of talking to Ro Gupta. You see him on the screen as well. Welcome, Ro, to this webinar. We have done these events where we bring in a successful entrepreneur and we will hear about his journey and lots to learn from him. But before that, I do want to thank all of our sponsors, which are absolutely critical to running any organization, a nonprofit like TIE. So we see those here. Thank you for each one of these sponsors. For some of you who may be new for a TIE webinar, TIE seminar, TIE is it's probably largest nonprofit global organization, started in 1992 in West Coast, primarily with focus on supporting entrepreneurs. It was founded by successful entrepreneurs who wanted to give back. 5 pillars of TIE: education, mentoring, networking, funding in the last few years has been more and more active, and incubation. We are supported primarily, the backbone of TIE is what's called charter members. Charter members are people who have been successful as entrepreneurs, successful executives in the corporate world, who want to give back, who want to share their learning and successes with new entrepreneurs, wannabe entrepreneurs. There are 3,000 charter members across the TIE global platform, 61 chapters across 14 countries, and 15,000 members. So welcome again. Today I will be talking to, and you've seen the brochure and flyer Sami put together with Ro. So let me give you a quick brief introduction of Ro here. So Ro, by the way, I've had the privilege of knowing Ro's parents, Pradeep and Kiran Gupta, here in Houston. They're Houston based. And Pradeep himself is a successful entrepreneur, so clearly Ro is following his footsteps. He certainly has all the right pedigrees of an immigrant family, which we see a lot of that. He was actually born in Kolkata in India, but moved to the US when he was a child. They lived in Pennsylvania, went to Princeton for his undergraduate, did his MBA from Northwestern Kellogg, and after doing a few stints in the Fortune 500, including Disney, he basically started co-founded this company called Carmera. So we're going to basically start with asking Ro to share, because I'm probably not going to do justice of all his professional background and things he's been involved in. So let's start with Ro. Just welcome again. If you would just share your personal background with all the participants here, I'll pass it on to you.
Sure thing. Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for having me to TIE Houston. And Arun, thank you for personally inviting me. Yeah, my background, I think you summed it up pretty well. I mean, to go a level deeper, I've actually, maybe I'll go backwards in time. Before Carmera, I was at a previous startup in kind of the, Web 2.0 sort of phase of technology in the 2010s, and really got my first taste of all of this, startups, digital technology, etc. right out of college. I graduated in 2000 from undergrad, and that was right in the right when the internet 1.0 and the bust was just about to happen. But got a bit of experience in interning for one of the internet 1.0 companies, and then later in that decade, as you noted, one of my my jobs was with Disney, but working in the digital, kind of innovation side of it. And so when you do that, you end up meeting a lot of startups. So, just getting some exposure to that early on, I think definitely influenced my wanting to actually be immersed in entrepreneurship and technology. But a lot of it actually also, particularly with regard to what we do at Carmera, which I can get to in a second, but also certainly like starting a company and being scrappy and entrepreneurial, certainly a lot of it goes to having been born in India, having parents and family members who, also started businesses or, were involved in in sort of startup type of ventures. And so I think it's a journey. I mean, the title of this is The Journey, or it has the word journey in it. That's a very appropriate title. It's at least for me, not something that was just sort of like I woke up one day and I had to start a high definition mapping company. It was decades probably of influences from childhood and then adolescence and then early professional
That's
career.
a good lead into the I think let's just follow to the journey. And by the way, just as housekeeping for all the participants, the chat functions available for you to ask any questions. We would go ahead and go through a couple of these conversational type, listen to Ro's journey for the next 40 plus minutes, and then I'm going to leave the last 15 minutes or so for any specific questions any one of you might have. So please feel free to put that on the chat. And I'll be keeping an eye on, Samia is going to keep an eye on. So back to Ro. So let's talk about the journey, right? So maybe we will start with the Carmera itself, and maybe starting with what does the name mean, and how did you sort of come with the idea, and what led you to starting this, and then maybe you can start about, how did that all happen, right? I mean, so sometimes always a story behind every entrepreneur, and how did that? What was the aha moment that says, okay?
Well, maybe would it be worthwhile just so people understand what we even do, to share some visuals. So I think you had suggested that might be helpful. So my colleague Darwan has helped gather a few slides that might be just helpful, so you know what the heck it is like Carmera actually does, and then kind of can get into how it all became about. So if you can see this, we broadly describe ourselves as a spatial AI company, but really what it is because of the whole revolution of IoT, Internet of Things, and being able to crowdsource data from the bazillions of sensors now that are everywhere, it opened up a lot of interesting opportunities in technology, one of them being in mapping. And so where we focus is in being able to sort of help solve the problem of when things change. A lot of the digital maps that have been created historically, like Google Maps on your phone, or maybe the map that's in your vehicle, in the infotainment panel, it's been very hard to reflect changes, at least, and certainly at scale, everywhere, global coverage, and also at the depth, something called high definition granularity that is becoming a necessity for advanced use cases. And so one of those advanced use cases is automated driving. And what you're looking at is one of the high definition maps that Carmera has created in the past that helps automated driving operate safely and reliably. And in fact, this is some of the reasons why a self-driving vehicle of some sort rely on these next generation high definition maps so heavily, because there's a number of things these brains in the vehicle are trying to figure out constantly. So where am I? What am I seeing? What do I do next? The technical terms for these are localization, perception, planning, prediction is part of it. There's a few other buzzwords, but the point is they all benefit greatly from these advanced maps that can aid with both redundancy and foresight in making these decisions, so that they're not just trying to do them in pure real time without any, they're almost like cheat codes or crutches to help make the decisions more reliably, right? And that's all well and good. These maps are difficult and expensive to build, but what's even harder and unsolved is, historically, we've been able to figure out how to build them, and create them for the first time, starting with highways. But now this industry has been struggling with the question of, well, how do I not just build them once, but maintain them when things change? And how do I do that everywhere, even on, say, residential streets versus just on highways as well. And that's really when, that's kind of, we could see that was coming even 6-7 years ago when we started the company. And so a lot of the genesis is, the expression of skating to where the puck is going. Very much we tried to do, when we started the company, kind of anticipating that this was going to be a hard problem, even if, people are focusing on lower order problems, when we actually started the company, more on the left-hand side of this chart back in 2015. And so fast forward a little bit, if just to understand a little bit more about what we actually do, one of the key things was to figure out how to crowdsource data because of that revolution of IoT sensors everywhere. And one of the insights, one of the ahas actually back in 2015, Arun, was realizing that there's these new things called dash cams. And I had never heard of them until actually, I think it was 2014 maybe. I was still at my previous startup. But A, at that previous startup, was very involved in our data products there. But then B, just kind of being an innocent bystander and sort of seeing some of the trends of what was going on in the world, it was a very funny story because I learned about dash cams because there was these viral videos, I think it was like in 2014 or 2013, of meteors crashing in Russia, or at least they were the videos were being taken from Russia. And it turns out that they happen so fast, and they happen in the sky, and they happen so fast that the only people that were able to capture them on camera were these people driving around with these dash cams mounted on their windshields. And it turns out, this is again 7 years ago. At that point, these dash cams were popular in countries like Russia, like China, like Korea, where either there were safety, security issues. Sometimes you get carjacking, whatever issues, or the insurance industry for whatever reason either was lacking or gave there was some value to having these basically security cameras for your vehicle. And so that was kind of actually a little bit of an aha moment that, interesting. If that combined with the technology making these cameras and internet connections so much cheaper and more ubiquitous, if that's going to be a macro trend, that presents something that we've just never seen before, this sort of ubiquity in street level, almost like Google Street View on steroids, like being able to crowdsource that. And so one of the insights early on was, well, could we figure out a symbiotic partnership with companies that have lots of vehicles driving around at high volumes and would value having some kind of security camera or safety sensing technology in the vehicles? And so, a long story short, we realized that commercial fleets like delivery vehicles, service vehicles, actually they were already starting to look into getting cameras in their vehicles for these reasons. And the concept, though, of kind of a barter arrangement where we mount these very cheap devices on their vehicles, we provide them a free service, something called telematics. So we show them where their vehicles are in real time and safety statistics to make sure their drivers are, operating safely, and also access to video should there be an accident or dispute or a coaching issue. And so anyway, that kicked off actually much of our journey. And this is really what allows us to do what we do. This is not the only way that we are able to source our data. And as we'll get to in a second, we just a couple months ago announced our acquisition by Woven Planet, which is the advanced mobility subsidiary of Toyota. So we are also have worked with and will continue to work with data from privately owned vehicles as well, personal automobiles. But I would say, that's a good example of back in 2014, 2015, we knew that was going to be many years, if not a decade, until it was, privacy and cybersecurity and all those other hurdles had been reached to be able to access, data or metadata from personally owned vehicles. And so the first thing we did was to sort of figure out how we could make this work with commercial vehicles. And so what that allows us to do then is really, this video shows ultimately though our actual commercialized product that we kind of developed from the raw camera data that you saw a second ago. So really, as I mentioned before, the hardest problem that we saw that was going to be unsolved was when things change, how do you reflect that very cheaply and quickly, but with the accuracy that a high definition map needs? And can you do that without the old, very manual ways of running a new survey vehicle, like a street view vehicle, over that street again, which is just costly and slow. And so this little video you're seeing, you can see on our website as well, kind of shows you a little bit of a case study. This is actually a real example from San Francisco of one of our delivery vehicles happened to go through a road in downtown San Francisco, and then again a few weeks later, and saw that all these things had changed that you saw in the video, like the lane paint, signs, overpasses. And so that's really our challenge, is at scale, at global scale, now Toyota scale. How do we do that, very cheap, fast, good, and really at automotive quality? So
one of the questions on because most of us here have seen Tesla as the sort of the forefront of technology, on not the fully self-driving, but so in a layman's term, what is unique here compared to whatever Tesla technology is? They're also claiming to be using all the maps and the vision and the cameras to self-driving. I mean, that's the goal, right? Eventually you're self-driving.
Yeah, I think there's two things that are, if you want to talk about Tesla specifically, there's two things that are unique. One is, going back to this image, Tesla's actually a bit of a outlier, let's say, in many ways. But one of them is that they, unlike the rest of the industry, do not design around high definition maps per se. That is something that we believe, what I told you about before, about how the vast majority of the industry is, considers maps something that is really kind of critical to operations. That's because they're so impactful on these three, this is a simplified version, but let's just say these three core decisions that the vehicle is always making. They add, like if you think about it, in the technology industry, we think about things in nines of reliability. So you'll often hear people say, oh, we have 3 nines reliability or 5 nines reliability. So 3 nines would be 99.9% of the time, we're up and running, or we're accurate, or whatever. And in automotive, that's one of the industries where you have to have more nines than almost any other industry. You have to
telecom is 5 nines.
Yeah, exactly. So you know all about that. So the point is, yeah, sure, you can do without a lot of things. You can do without high definition maps. You can do without LiDARs. You can do without, you can drive a car with your feet if you want to, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea, especially if there's enabling technologies that are getting fast and cheap and ubiquitous enough to take advantage of, so that you can keep adding nines to that equation. And that's where I think there's a big departure between the Tesla philosophy and the rest of the industry, which is that if you are able to leverage these other redundancies and sort of sources of truth, you should. And I will say, I think a fair concern that Tesla has voiced is the scalability of high definition maps. At least I believe they voiced it, or at least others have, including, by the way, us and Toyota. But I think that's precisely why our focus has been to do this in a way that does not rely on sort of slow, expensive ways to map the world and keep them maintained. So, the two key tenets that we've really adopted, as well as our new parents at Toyota's Woven Planet, is at least for maintenance, doing so with camera-based approaches is the only real way you can get down to roughly 2 orders of magnitude faster and cheaper of maintaining maps, which is what's required. So that's about 100 times. And then the other thing that is, I think, also quite unique to, say, the Woven Planet and Toyota approach versus the Tesla approach is, Tesla's much more insular, and a lot of companies, by the way, also, you know, traditional companies like a Google or Apple tend to be much more black box, walled garden when it comes to their data.
Right.
The approach that we are taking as a part of something called the automated mapping platform, which is within this Toyota subsidiary called Woven Planet, that is meant to be a very platform neutral approach, sort of being very agnostic to how either another automaker or even a mapping company or, you know, a delivery company looking for better navigation data. We have a much more agnostic, almost like an Android type of approach of, hey, you don't have to use our hardware. You can provide your own data in. You can have control about how that data either is delivered only to yourself, or if you want to also allow others in the ecosystem to use it. I think that's the other thing that is also quite unique about the strategy that we're employing.
You believe this whole crowdsourcing is where the industry is heading? I'm assuming apps like Waze are also using crowdsourcing. They're using every other data out there on the road to give you the best navigation compared to a traditional. You know.
Yeah, Waze is a good kind of analogy, especially for people who aren't in the industry, which is, I mean, you can think of what we're doing at Carmera and the automated mapping platform is essentially like the next generation, you know, kind of a high definition version of the Waze concept of kind of using crowdsourcing. But, you know, Waze is very much doing so with, you know, very rudimentary data that's either from just the GPS traces from your phone or from user generated content where someone's being expected to like push a button on the phone and say, hey, there was an accident here or something. So now that we're using actual camera imagery combined with machine learning and computer vision, you can, you know, the kind of the shorthand for that would be basically AI.
Right.
You can get to much higher levels of signal, of insight and accuracy, and still do it very cheaply, kind of like the way Waze does it, which is, you know, you don't have to pay people to do it. You can crowdsource it. So I think it's a good. It's just a way of thinking about a new paradigm, which is building upon the crowdsourcing concept that Waze introduced, you know, 15 years ago.
Don't mind, put that on the full screen, because I think that's some one of the.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
We can see it better. So, let's you know, we're going to basically talk about that. You spent a fair amount of time on technology and the product side, and then let's switch gear on the business side. So when you started the company, you had this idea. In the first 2 years, what sort of business goals you guys gave yourself, and how did you decide? And how was the journey in the first couple of years of starting the company, and, you know, starting, you know, with the hiring people or the process? So share some of those.
Sure. There may be some visuals in here that are helpful for that too. This is a bit about the business model, but we can go back to that later. Oh yeah, here. So I mean, basically, you know, I often think about the journey to date in like 2 or 3 acts. The first one being really just, you know, the insight I shared before was really what got us started even when we were in stealth phase in 2015, 2016, which was proving that this hunch was actually real. So that the fact that, you know, partnering with commercial fleets was actually a good way to crowdsource data that could actually work, that the data from it was usable. This concept, we invented this term called pro-sourcing, because it was kind of our little twist on crowdsourcing, but not from consumers, but from professionals, you know, almost like a B2B version of crowdsourcing. So that was kind of the first task at hand, and showing that even like it wasn't actually showing, in our case, it wasn't showing necessarily the, you know, recurring revenue and everything, because for us, we were, you know, very much in a frontier industry, you know, and kind of a deep tech frontier industry. And I think it's really good early on to kind of be real with yourself about what, especially, by the way, if you're kind of if you plan to raise money, and especially venture money, kind of be clear about your story and how you're going to be perceived for your journey, because different types of companies will have different milestones they're expected to hit. So if we had said, hey, we're going to be this SaaS company, and by month 12 we can expect this, you know, customer acquisition costs and this long-term, value of each customer and this repeatability. We're gonna have great metrics, and you're gonna have these nice linear charts. We would have really, I think, screwed ourselves because that's not we were going into a very immature, like new frontier industry. So instead, what we tried to lay out for ourselves is first prove that there's a technology fit, and prove that this kind of theoretical concept of crowdsourcing or pro-sourcing through these professional fleets works, and that on the axis of, there's a cliche of good, fast, cheap. So, as with anything in innovation, most likely you're trying to do all three. But the issue is it's really difficult usually to do all three well at the same time, in the same planning period. So I think in the early days, we were like, you know what, we know this whole high definition, super, accurate down to centimeters type of map is something that we're being told is going to be needed. But for now, let's focus on, instead of building that all out, a full HD map product out right now, let's prove though that the North Star that everyone told us is going to be a problem. We spoke with people, on the early Google self-driving team, Google Maps team, companies like Cruise, who are co-owned by GM and a self-driving car company. And they all kind of said like, look, it's going to be this problem of maintaining maps is going to be hard. So we said, let's prove that first, even if we're only kind of working on the cheap and fast dimensions of this, and kind of like, we can kind of lead people to believe that ultimately the good part of it we can also show. So that was the first phase of it, is can we show that crowdsourcing this data cheaply and with a much higher refresh rate, meaning vehicles are seeing the same street much more quickly than maybe once a year, once every 2 years that you'd see a street view image. Can we actually prove that out? And so that was our first milestone. That's what we raised our seed round in 2015 with basically on a cocktail napkin. We barely even had a deck. And then sure enough, that's what we also then raised the next round on, that we'd proved that yes, this model works. It is much cheaper and much faster than the old ways of doing street level mapping, kind of the street view way of doing Google Street View. And that, we're not showing you that that this can actually go into full high definition map yet, or that we're making revenue from it. But we also have validation from other mapping companies, from the real estate industry, from academic institutions that yes, this data is, high quality enough to be useful for developing a spatial index, or even for, let's say a real estate company to gain insights on, where to put a new retail store. So that was how we positioned our first act.
So
any questions?
Follow-on question there for a second. So if the intent was trying to establish the thesis of whether we can do this, and which clearly you guys did, and as you raise funding, we'll talk about funding a little bit more in detail. Was there sort of the planned intellectual property mode around, because you're using a lot of crowdsourcing data, right? Was there ability to also create? Because I'm sure the investors, anybody looks at any company, looks at that, what's the more? But is it going to be IP protection? So can you share some thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, no, definitely. So I think first off, doing something that's hard, and especially, by the way, something that involves atoms, not just bits, I think kind of just naturally helps, helps kind of put you in a little bit of a different category, because there's going to be a lot less noise. Like my previous startup, for example, was all purely digital. It was a purely web application, and there were like every other week there would be some clone, because it just wasn't hard to replicate. You could in a weekend hackathon, someone could. It was actually an internet commenting system. So in like a weekend hackathon, someone could whip something up, and there's a lot of noise. I think I saw much less noise with Carmera, because again, like really deep tech where the talent tends to be more specialized. You're, like I said, you're working with the real world. It's not just digital. It's getting on ladders and installing sensors on Sprinter vans in the middle of February. Not a lot of people are willing to do that, at least not as much as my previous startup. I think that certainly helps. I think there's certainly things that are good to do early on. Like we did decide to to initiate a patent process on some of our IP. And I think that is also, I have a complicated view on patent system and what's, broken about it, quite frankly, and what I philosophically agree or disagree with. But I will say tactically, and also, what a good thing for both investors and acquirers is you do want to be smart about that. You can usually, one thing I would say for scrappy entrepreneurs, you can spend a lot of money and time on it. So one thing I would say is try to have a good feel for the minimum viable protection you need in the early days, and versus going overboard on filing a zillion patents that are going to cost a ton of money, and in every single country around the world you could really run up a big bill. Right. So I think we try to be smart about, okay, what's the minimum amounts we need to do in year 1 versus year 3 versus year 5, for a patent portfolio. So that's another quick thing. And then the last I would say the major moat, I think the first two are around just IP. Some of it is trade secrets that are just, you kind of do with effort and sweat that other people may not be willing to do. And the other is around, as I said, about patents and things like that. But the third is around kind of the stickiness of both relationship building and network effects. And I would also encourage people to think about that ahead of time. In our case, relationship building is actually a pretty big moat, especially in automotive. So this, you can see there's no automotive logos on this page, but on the next page there are, and some of them we had to redact. But in both automotive and autonomous vehicles, it's a small, community. There's you're talking maybe a dozen real automotive OEMs outside of China in the world, and then same thing in the, in the kind of new breed of autonomous vehicle companies, maybe a dozen, maybe a couple dozen if you're generous. And by the way, in some of those categories, it's really shrunken to only maybe half a dozen companies that matter. So, it's a very, finite list of stakeholders that really matter. You can list the key contacts in probably 100 rows of Excel that you really need to know. Right. And it's a long cycle business. They don't just make knee-jerk reactions on choosing a supplier. It's a process. It's a journey. It's a journey within a journey, right? So my point is that's also a mode in itself. If you're just coming off the street as some hotshot who claims to have a shiny new object, you're not going to just kind of automatically be accepted overnight. You really have to it's a very consultative purpose. You have to, get a lot of people in the room. And so I think that in itself, if you're willing to do that, can definitely be a moat, especially if you have investors who understand that, who understand that, yeah, you're not going to convert the contract in, 3 months. It may take 3 years, but having milestones, interim milestones of where they can see, okay, you've won a POC, and then that POC leads to a bigger POC, and then that leads to a pre-production type of relationship. That's sort of the savvy investors who know those types of industries will understand that.
So talk about related to you said it's deep and it's a hard technical problem you're trying to solve. And I'm assuming, you're not the one writing code, and you may understand this. So how did you go about, and what was some of the challenges of putting a team together and finding the right talent and making it all work? Because this is hard work, right? So this is, share some of that, please.
Well, one thing I will say is, well, first off, just, I think team building is very much, can have both a compounding effect in both ways. So both in positive feedback loops and quite frankly in negative feedback loops. So I think it's really, and you're not going to get every single hire right. We've had a lot of folks and we're still friends with who've maybe some founder candidates that I thought maybe we would do this with, but we decided mutually that it wasn't the right fit, but still sort of maintained friends and sort of helped as advisors. Same thing with employees. Sometimes people join and it is a great fit, or it's not, or maybe you try out working with each other on a consulting relationship. I would just encourage people, I think those first few hires, and certainly your founders, they're just so critical because kind of talent begets talent. and A players lead to hiring other A players, and then the opposite is also true. And I think one of the things that also helped us is not just our some of our founding teams and employees who really, unfortunately for us, really did start off of, I think, a very positive feedback loop of hiring great people, but also I think the regions that we initially hired in, and also kind of the different technical disciplines that Carmera cuts across. It really expanded the surface area of interest. So let me cover both of those. Regionally, I think we were very deliberate in, first off, we started the company in New York, and then soon after we also introduced our second engineering hub in Seattle. We do have a small office in San Francisco, but we really felt confident that New York and Seattle are excellent hubs for technical talent. But we could be really unique. Like, we're probably, I still think to this day, maybe the only autonomous vehicle technology company in New York. And so, we can really stand out, and we have built really strong networks in New York. And then same thing in Seattle. There's a few others, but really we're pretty unique as well in terms of what we do there. If you compare that to the Bay Area, it's just, like, it's just run amok with mapping companies, autonomous vehicle companies, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's something. Now, I will say the rules are being rewritten now with COVID, and there's, just a lot more remote workers, including with us. But I think that was really advantageous for us. I think that the second point I made was, in terms of getting top talent, was, yes, the core things we do, like working on robot cars, is really interesting. And like I said, in the markets, the talent markets we're in, were pretty unique. But it's not just that. There's all these buzzwords that can rattle off around IoT technologies, machine learning, big data. I rattle off a zillion others, and also, by the way, urban technologies with a very sort of civic mission to it as well. And I think that also really helped us, because top talent, yeah, of course you have to be competitive on basic things, like, is it a good financial opportunity, a good culture, et cetera. But top technical talent really, like, they tend to, I think, get very excited when you can broaden their horizons, and it's not just a very narrow technical field. You, as I said, you can really expand the surface area of interests. And I think that really helped us, because not a lot of people are interested in driverless cars or maps at Carmera, but not all. Actually, a lot of them came at it from a very different angle of interests, and then they became interested in maps or driverless cars. It's not like they were necessarily before we hired them. So I think that's really helpful as well, if you can tell a bigger story than just one narrow application.
So let's shift gears on the capital, right? So which is you start with seed. Talk about how many capital raises you did. How did you decide when to do, and how much to do before the final exit, and also the lessons learned you might want to share with some of the other entrepreneurs who may be going through the same process or thinking about that?
Sure. Well, one caveat I'll say is, the capital markets have gone insane, and all the rules are different from when so back, this is when, in 2015 is when we raised our seed round. And I thought it was, look, I guess I'm showing my age, but, I was used to sort of much different, sort of standards and norms around how much you raise, what proof you have to show when you raise it, from, the early 2000s. Because even in 2015, as I mentioned before, we had not built anything, and we barely even had a deck, and we raised, like a little over $2 million. And I thought that was, whoa, so like impetuous and, kind of a little bit wild. But I would say, like I said, that the rules have been really rewritten, because like in the earlier eras, you wouldn't raise that much money until much further along, typically maybe more in Series A time, and with much more proof. But I think what's happened is, there's definitely kind of a little bit of a barbell effect going on of where the money's going, where I think in the early stages, and actually there's a good, really good post by a venture capitalist recently called Mark Suster, actually kind of a friend, and who I think summarizes just in the last week, where you see this barbell effect of lots and lots of money going into early stage, like especially these seed stages. Often, there's new names for them now, like pre-seed or first check, or like embryo, whatever. There's all these, like, people are just going earlier and earlier and earlier, and there's pretty large sums of money that are going to folks often before there's anything built or any product. And then the other thing is also happening where at later stages, once there is a lot of proof and traction, huge checks, hundreds of millions of dollars, even in still private companies, are getting written. I think in between, those kind of B plus or minus, series B plus or minus stage, maybe, I'm sure the valuations, the check sizes are still bigger, but I don't think it's the pool of money has expanded quite as much in those early stages. I mean, sorry, in those middle stages. So that's one observation. For us, what we tried to do was, we were kind of in the early innings of that barbell. I think it's sort of on steroids now, but in 2015, we were maybe just starting to see it at least in the seed side. And so what we raised probably a bigger round than I was expecting, at least, pre-product. But and I think that the next round we did, so that was about 2.25 in 2015. The next round we did in late 2016. We weren't really necessarily planning to raise, and it was a bit opportunistic because we were approached by some existing investors and also some ones we just known from previous jobs that, hey, like, we like what you're doing, and maybe we would somewhat preemptively you'd be interested in a round. So our Series A, which was still in this sort of stealth phase, was, I think more of a still kind of a seed round, because we still didn't really have a product, it didn't really have customers, but it was opportunistic. It happened to be called an A. It was about 4.5 million or something like that. But I think actually it wasn't until this phase when we actually launched and we had real customers, we had real traction, we had logos that matter, like robotaxi companies like Toyota, et cetera, that were using our stuff, that we raised our last institutional round, which was a $20 million round led by Google Ventures, GV now. And it was called a B, but in my old school terminology, I always thought of that as our true Series A round. And I think there is, for people, there's definitely like a psychological difference between all the seed money versus that A round, where, like, I think there's a much higher bar for proof on those A rounds, I think. And so the way we try to navigate that was actually try to really not raise, like to try to minimize what we raise until we felt like we had that bar of proof for that first A/B round, the $20 million round in 2018. Because once you get into that, once you do raise that first real A/B round where you have some sense of product market fit, the bar, you're really kind of starting a series of expectations that get more and more challenging, even with success, and so I think I would just caution people, even with all the money being thrown around, is to kind of know what you're setting yourself up with, because not every company is some companies may be more linear for a long time until they have their hockey stick moment. Others have a big hockey stick moment at the beginning and then all of a sudden hit a plateau. So it's really hard to predict that. And I think for us, I think one thing we did in hindsight pretty well is sort of what I'll call a Goldilocks a capital raising plan, which is, we had competitors who weren't able to raise enough and weren't able to, for example, make it through the slowdown in automated driving, which there was. It's still very much happening, but there was kind of a delay of timelines. And so a lot of startups ended up not making that. They ran out of money. And also same thing with COVID. COVID also had, things have really roared back, but things that definitely had a kind of a chasm effect. And so if you don't have enough to get through that, you're not going to do well. However, there's also companies we know who, quite frankly, I think raised too much and too early. And therefore the expectations, the next milestones, the next bars they had to hit were very high. And so again, when these troughs, these delays, these chasms start to open and become bigger, then you're really setting yourself up for trouble, because you've already raised all this money, you've already grown the team to try to hit these really ambitious milestones, but maybe you should have tempered yourself a little bit until you're really confident that you'll have the commercial proof, even in a business in a sort of macro downturn, which we had. And I think for us, again, so much of this is in hindsight. We were able to kind of not be too capital deficient, but also not be overcapitalized in terms of everything that's happened in the last 18 months in the industry.
That's good advice. So let's switch gear to the exit. So did you actually have an exit plan when you raised the 20 million round with the investors? Had some expectation of certain timeline before exit would be looked for, and how did that happen? Share the process in the journey and some of the lessons learned from the exit process.
Yeah, I mean, as you see, there's a bunch of, through this journey, as I said, so much of it was very relationship-driven business, and there's a dozen other logos here that we developed really good relationships with over the years. But Toyota was one that certainly stuck out. All those things I mentioned about our product, our strategy, camera-based technology, but combined with kind of a platform agnostic, model for serving the industry. I think what happened last year was, so this is a good seg, because last year we saw that, okay, we have a really good idea now what this industry wants in terms of a go-to-market model, in terms of technology. There's something that we figured out, not really important, but it's called change as a service. So, as I mentioned, change management for these high definition maps is really important. And we realized that we had this unique way of almost decoupling just the dynamic elements of a map and being able to deliver it to other companies, whether they're automotive companies or mapping companies that needed help with map movements. Point was, that kind of working on that technology and having a good feedback loop with those companies was really helpful, because then it made us realize that the next big task at hand was showing that we could do this at scale, and also having the assets to do this on top of that we're already at scale. Meaning, we are a small company, we didn't have a continental-wide base map already built, unlike a lot of mapping companies or automotive companies already had. But we did have a very elegant approach to, on top of someone else's map, to detect, change, and update those maps in a very good, fast, cheap way, right? And so once we and a lot of other companies in the space who can't really talk about realized that, it became pretty obvious that not just a commercial relationship may make sense, but also potentially in an actual acquisition, because having focus and being able to apply your technology to just one company's tech stack can really de-risk the execution. Even if in the long term you do want to work with a lot of other companies. And that ultimately is what led to our conversations with this group at Toyota, who we've been working with already for 2-3 years. But the nature of those conversations changed into more of a strategic M&A conversation, as opposed to purely just a service provider. And you fast forward to a couple months ago, and there's in terms of technology fit, in terms of team and talent fit, they're really looking to expand in North America. In terms of where the industry cycle was, it was just by far, I think, the best match. And then we made it happen.
So there's a question on one of the panelists. There's, the Toyota now being you're part of Toyota, and the whole concept of crowdsourcing, able to use all the data. How would that buy-in from the other tier ones? Is Toyota going to allow that? Would that somehow, the value prop you have about trying to get all the crowdsourced data and able to share across all the different entities?
Great question. I think if you'd asked me this 4 or 5 years ago, I'd say, it's tough. Like, no OEM wants to work with another. They all think their data is really like the bee's knees, and no one wants to pool it or share it or do anything. That has definitely changed. There's already now a lot more cooperation and collaboration in the industry. Everyone gets that, yes, there's cutthroat competition in many aspects of automotive and mobility, but this is actually not new. It's actually been pretty commonplace in industries like auto for companies to share investments that doesn't make sense for one company to foot the bill themselves. Like even powertrain technologies and battery technologies and all this. That's happened. So I think similarly with map data, I think first off, a lot of people realized, there's all these cliches of data is the new oil, that we heard 5 years ago, and I think it's a catchy phrase, and there's some truth to that, but the raw data itself is very much a commodity and not actually that valuable by itself. In fact, if you want to use the data as the new oil analogy, what I've often internally relayed to my team is, okay, fine, it's the new oil, but it's crude. It's the crude oil. And if you look at the gas and oil industry from Rockefeller, right, hundreds of years now, or whatever it's been, that's not how the commercialization really, became a reality. It was the refineries and the pipelines that, Standard Oil really made their big fortune on and ultimately led to this enormous industry. And
Right.
so I think there's an analogy there too with vehicle data and, just generally IoT type data where, first off, there's just so many sensors that it's not like one company alone can have the monopoly on that anyway. And even if they did, they're just the raw data, it's not useful by itself. So it really makes sense for there to be kind of a pooling across the industry, but also in a trusted way. Like, you need to trust a company that knows quality, they know security, privacy, functional safety. They are also making commitments to have full control over someone's data that is agreeing to put it into this ecosystem. So, meaning if I'm putting my data in, like I want to have control over who gets access to it out, not just, my vehicles, but maybe another company. And that's, by the way, the last thing I'll say on this is, I think the timing of Woven Planet, again, Toyota's, the subsidiary called Woven Planet is very new. It was only stood up in January. And I think the timing is really interesting because of what I said. I think there's been a reception to being part of a platform, even if it's especially if it's backed by a company, an automotive company that people trust for quality, scale, security, privacy. But if you notice, the name Toyota is not in Woven Planet. And that was very deliberate, by the way, from President Akio Toyoda himself. He and the CEO of Woven Planet, a man named James Kuffner, long background in robotics, Google self-driving project, et cetera, really wanted Woven Planet to very deliberately not be limited to just serving Toyota, and quite frankly, not even just to serving automotive. They want to be able to serve other industries outside of automotive. So that kind of name is actually very indicative of that desire to really signal to the industry, hey, this is meant to be a platform-based approach that is, again, a little bit more similar to the Android model, where you're giving people putting things in and taking things out, that flexibility and control that they want.
So is Carmera the sort of the platform acquisition for Woven Planet, or they've already had other acquisitions, or what how do you see under this new banner and your role for the next couple of years? How do you, because a lot of times the entrepreneurs, once they get acquired, they can't deal with the bureaucracy of a large corporation. That's not their DNA. And usually part ways. So, but I'm assuming this is sort of unique and different because this is a new entity within Toyota, looks like, which is formed for a very different purpose.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why, as I earlier said, there's so many facets about this opportunity to become a part of Woven Planet and the acquisition that were attractive. One of them was exactly what you're referring to, which is yes, we're a startup being acquired by a much larger company. Now, Woven, they started the year at maybe 600-700 people. Now it's almost 1,400. So it's growing very fast. It's much larger than, we were 50 people when we got acquired, but it's still very new. It's kind of like a big startup. And as you said, it's like growing at startup pace. It's more than doubled in the last year. And that was very attractive. Look, there's a lot of challenge to that at keeping up with that pace and, the natural, kind of chaos, but it's also very much why people come to work for us. They really like that pace and the little bit of operating in white space and things like that. So yeah, I think that was actually, I would also say, we're asking about raising capital versus exits. I think that was a huge appeal for myself and our whole team, which was this kind of presented the best of both an exit and raising another round. We had considered also just raising our Series C. Right. And it was both. It was so, on one hand, it was an exit, liquidity, very, all stakeholders are, very happy with that result. But also it's a way to fund the next phase that we would have wanted to fund in a minority investment for years with, huge, not just money, which is also certainly part of it, and funding us doubling, the size of our team yet again, but also assets, technology assets that we wouldn't have otherwise had access to. So for example, these global scale base maps that automated mapping platform within Woven Planet is already building out, or vehicle data at Toyota scale, those are just really, really attractive to sort of have the best of both worlds, of both an acquisition and a new capital raise.
Very good. The chat is open for another couple of minutes. I do have one very specific technical question. Somebody's asking, how do you deal with all the construction cones in your maps, and how do they not become part of the map itself?
Well, actually, if we have time, I can actually show you. The other video I didn't show you earlier, let's see if I can scroll to it, was construction is actually how we started in terms of perfecting our technology for, here it is, for change. Yeah. And so actually one of the very first computer vision, ML-based classifiers and detectors we built were the types of objects that typically indicate that there's a construction zone or work zone. So for example, I won't go into all of it, some of it is sort of IP, but we had to train a lot of these neural networks to look for things that typically construction zone sees. And you can actually see some of those firing right there, pylons and cones and barrier plastic. And so, it was just a neat project because we got to do things, in, like having ourselves or interns all over the country, all over the world, set up little, fake construction zones, and in some cases looking for real ones and seeing if it worked. So, and that, by the way, that goes back to another thing I said, which is if you're willing to not just work with bits, but also work in the real world and do things in the field with atoms, like that in itself can be kind of a differentiator, and it sort of attracts a certain type of person who likes that kind of thing, as opposed to someone who just wants to kind of type on the keyboard and ship code and that's it. So yeah, I think that's part of the fun, I guess you could say.
Great. Ro, I truly appreciate it. Thank you for a fairly insightful sharing of lots of different aspects of starting a business, running a business, fundraising, exit, and hopefully there's a part 2 where you're going to continue to grow this piece. Normally we would be doing these things in person, but I've invited you to come to Houston. We would have a networking after that. You get to meet people. Sometime down the road, we'll probably get back to that. But for now, I appreciate you doing it on virtual. I'll have Samia get your address. We'll mail you a little token of appreciation gift from Ty. I know you're also speaking with Ty in the East Coast. I know there's another event.
Oh yeah, that's right. Actually, you reminded me, there's 2 plugs I wanted to make. One is coincidentally in 2 weeks from tomorrow, I think, is it 1st of October, whenever that is, on a panel at Ty Boston, or the conference that they're hosting in Boston. And so if anyone is around for that, we'll be there. And then the other plug I wanted to make was just anyone who either has interesting, maybe they're an entrepreneur working in some kind of related mobility technology. Woven Planet, first off, they've been pretty acquisitive. That we've, besides us, they also acquired Lyft's self-driving unit earlier in the year. And so we're always looking for opportunities. Same thing with investments. There's an $800 million growth fund called Woven Capital. Those tend to be for later stage companies, but there's also an early stage one outside of Woven Planet called Toyota Ventures. So if you're working on anything remotely related to mobility AI type technologies, please get in touch. And then same thing with people looking for career opportunities. We're hiring, we're really ramping that up. There'll be more and more things listed on our jobs page at carmera.com/join if you want to go there. And also you can email me directly anytime at ro@carmera.com. That's probably the most memorable email address. I have a separate Woven Planet one, but ro@carmera.com or carmera.com/join. Reach out anytime.
Cool, very good. Well, thank you again, and thanks for everybody who was able to attend. We have recorded this, and it'll be available for those participants who registered but were not able to join today. But so they'll be out there. So with that, we'll close the session. And Ro, thanks again, and good luck for your next phase of this journey.
Thanks so much, Arun. Thanks.
And
thanks
then
for
next time
inviting me.
in Houston, do let me know.
We'll do.
Thank you.
Okay. Ciao. Bye.
Bye.